So I've been teaching at SEPA since 2007, and I teach 3 different classes. I teach a course which is part of the core curriculum. So part of your core, if you're an MIA or an MPA, includes taking statistics and economics and policy, and then you're required to take a management course. So either a management course or a financial management course. I teach one of those financial management courses. So I teach a course on nonprofits and finance. And I teach that both semesters. And then I also teach a course on social entrepreneurship, which I will talk about. And then I teach a course on what's called design for social innovation, which I will also talk about. And then a little bit more about my background. So I am not an academic or a researcher. I'm a practitioner. I've been working in the nonprofit education space since the 90s. With a focus on urban education and equity and equality of access. I've helped start 6 nonprofits, all again focused on equity, and then 3 of them focused on ed tech. Does everyone know what ed tech is? Education technology. And what's interesting about that and today is that in 1996, when I started a nonprofit, because I had a computer and an email address, and I thought the revolution was happening, and I thought that our industrial school system was going to transform suddenly to an information age one. I started a nonprofit to help bring technology to schools and ensure sort of equitable access, and I thought then that we were going to be done. And it's now 24 years later, and really for the first time, I think that revolution is happening, and that's really because of COVID. So for folks who've been in the education technology space, this is the first time we're seeing real traction because schools have been forced to go online, and I think this will be a pivotal moment. So that's been really exciting for me. I'll tell you a little bit in a minute about a program I launched during COVID to support education entrepreneurs, not students, but people outside of the Columbia community that's currently in week 4 of a 5-week program. So I'm deep in it right now, so I can talk about that. And then finally, the one thing I want to talk about later is my students. So the reason I teach, and I never intended to be a teacher ever. If you went backwards and told the 18-year-old me that I would be a teacher, I'd say there's no way. But somehow I am, and sort of my greatest joy as a teacher is getting to know the students and staying connected with students. So I'm probably in touch with, with dozens of alumni, many of whom are doing innovative things in the world. So I'll share some of their stories as well. I'm just going to pause for a second because I don't like being the only one talking. Does anyone have any questions about my background or why I picked SEPA, or is there anything you want to add to what I'm going to discuss? Too shy. Okay. Well, again, please raise your hand or just type in the chat. So I guess I want to talk a little bit about my SEPA teaching and why I teach what I teach. So when I started teaching at SEPA, I started teaching this nonprofit course. And at some point I said to myself, and actually to my dean at the time, I said, I'm kind of teaching a model that's broken. And I love nonprofits, but nonprofits for the most part, I don't know if you know this, but nonprofits can't have owners, right? Nonprofits are public charities. They belong to the public. And the fact that they can't have owners means there's no such thing as equity. You can't invest in a nonprofit. So if there's no investment in nonprofits, it's almost impossible to scale, right? The way you scale a nonprofit is you raise more money. And so it's very hard. If any of you worked in nonprofits, you can just sort of wave. It's really, nonprofits for the most part, every single year have to go out and raise new dollars or renew dollars. And you spend 80% of your life trying to raise money. And scale is almost impossible because you'd have to build such reserves to do that. And nonprofits can't really build reserves, right? Like a savings account, because they need to spend money on programs. So scale is virtually impossible. I realized that. And then I also realized that most nonprofits were not really measuring impact, right? And it's hard to sell yourself if you don't have real data, but most nonprofits were getting what I will call output data, right? Like we serve 50 people in our program. Um, but beyond that, so what? Like, so let's say you run an after school program, the fact that you serve 50 kids, how did that actually impact those kids, right? What are the actual outcomes? And very few nonprofits have real outcome data, or you've probably heard the term social impact. That term is almost meaningless because very few organizations have any real social impact data. Social impact means you're like long lasting change, right, on either an individual or a community, and it's almost impossible to track that. So I basically thought this sector is struggling and dysfunctional and has no real ability, and we haven't really solved any problems in the world, right? So nonprofits in theory are set up to solve a problem, and then they should go out of business, right? Has anyone heard of a nonprofit that went out of business because it was done? Anyone? I see nodding, meaning you agree, like you're never finished. And so I thought there's something wrong with this inherently. And then I got interested in this concept of social entrepreneurship. And not that that's fixing everything, because I still, there are issues there too, but I thought there has to be a better way. And then I realized that the business school had a social enterprise course. And I thought they're new models. It's called social enterprise and impact investing. And we didn't even know that term at that point, impact investing. But I went to my dean and I said, why is this program at the business school and not at SEPA? Because if you think about social entrepreneurship, to me, the most important thing, if you want to be a social entrepreneur, is understanding the social and cultural context of the problems you're trying to solve. And I didn't think that the business students per se had all that knowledge, but actually SEPA students do. And so I thought, why don't we have a class like that here? So I started teaching a course on social enterprise, and which has been amazing. And I can talk about it. And we just finished our class this week. But it's sort of students who, and this is a great thing to do while you're in school. So this is my advice to you in school. Like, one beauty of being in school is you get to pause a little bit. Right. So if you're working, you just keep going. School is your time to actually pause and figure out, like, what is it I want to do with my life and what problems do I want to solve, and sort of open your eyes to that. So I actually think school is a great time to work on a venture. And so I teach a social entrepreneurship course in the fall that is not necessarily aimed at starting your venture as you exit, right? I realized quickly, and I was sort of naive, I thought, oh, I'll start a social enterprise class and then people will just start social enterprises, while they're in school or immediately after. Not really realizing it takes years to actually get something off the ground. So what I've evolved my class into is a class where you spend a lot of time thinking about what the problem you want to solve is and verifying that that problem truly exists. So I went from teaching a business planning class that basically said, come up with an idea and write a business plan, to then really focusing my class on need finding. So has anyone heard the term human-centered design thinking? So, and I'm jumping around, I know, and I kind of talk all over the place, but so I started teaching this social enterprise class. It was a business planning class, like find a problem in the world, collect some data, and then write a business plan, and then you'll go launch it. And then I went to a workshop, now I'd say 6 years ago, on design thinking. So design thinking is basically a fancy term that basically says talk to your customer before you design something for them. Oriola, 1 second and I will call on you. And I went to a workshop and I was told to design a gift for a colleague. So someone in the room. So I was in a room with 50 people at Columbia Business School, and I was paired up with a woman named Jenny McGill, who actually is a professor at SEPA and runs the program called EPD, Economic and Political Development. and I didn't know Jenny well at the time. And so maybe someone can answer this. So I was told that I was going to be designing a gift for Jenny. So, but we hadn't gone through the workshop yet. So instantly in my head, I thought, okay, who is Jenny? Right? Jenny's a 40-something-year-old woman. And then I probably would have designed a gift for a 40-year-old woman making all kinds of assumptions about Jenny, right? But instead, they took us through this 2-hour exercise where I had to interview Jenny and ask her about her experience with gifting. And we ended up having a long dialogue about the holidays and how she, and I won't tell you her whole personal story, but basically her relationship to gifts, right? And a very personal relationship, because if you start telling stories, you get to know a person and you get to see what they sort of emotionally respond to. So long story short, she told me lots of stories about gifting, and I realized a lot about her in that process. I then sketched out, right? So that was my need finding, that was my interviewing. I then sketched out a number of gifts on a piece of paper. And then I explained them to her and she responded to me on them. And sort of I watched her response and which one had some meaning to her, because it connected to the stories she had told me about her relationship with gifts and her feelings about family members and her role in her family. And then we sort of picked one that resonated with her. And then I actually built a prototype out of pipe cleaners and little cups and, googly eyes and stuff like that. And then I built her the gift and I presented it to her. And that experience sounds quite simple, but it made me realize so many things. One, we make a ton of assumptions about people and their needs unless we actually have deeper empathy for them, right? So I've started 6 nonprofits without actually going through the experience I went through with Jenny, right? I decided in 1996 that since I had a computer and businesses had a computer, that schools needed computers, and I showed up, right? And I raised money and I showed up. Had I actually talked to the principals of those schools to understand, and the teachers to understand, like, what kept them up at night, what motivated them, how did they feel, I would have designed a very different intervention or program. But I made a lot of assumptions and in a way was very arrogant. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs and nonprofits have done the same thing, right? A lot of nonprofits who are well-meaning have made decisions about what people need, and they show up and it's often free and it's often funded. And so we keep giving stuff to people. At some point, my daughter, who's now 18, was in elementary school at a public school in New York City, and her school had 24 programs provided by external organizations, mostly nonprofits providing programming like, after school Spanish program or a literacy or a math or a STEM or a sports. And I at some point said to the principal, how did you choose these 24 programs? And almost none had she chosen, but they sort of showed up and said, hey, we have this free thing, do you want it? And funders, right? If any of you have raised money from a foundation, the funder never called the school and said, do you want this program? Right? The funder just trusted me, the nonprofit, to give it to them. And so we wonder why in a school with 24 outside resources, not everything is great, right? And that school actually had a lot of problems. I ended up moving my daughter because the school was failing so many kids. So these resources weren't helping because the resources weren't based on the school need. They were based on lots of other people's assumptions about what schools need. So I went through that design exercise and I said, like, wow, everything I've done my whole life has been wrong. And if I'm teaching students to write business plans, I'm teaching them to be sort of arrogant and make a lot of assumptions. Instead, they should just spend the entire class talking to people to find out what they need and what the problem really is before they design their idea. So long story short, I totally evolved my class, and my class is now based on this sort of design structure, model and structure. I'm going to pause because someone had a question and I've lost them, but the person who raised their hand, do you have a question? I think your name began with A. Maybe I answered it.
I believe it was Oriola. Oriola, I've given you the ability to unmute yourself. You can feel free to ask your question.
Oh, and someone else has their hand raised.
Edia?
And Edia, tell me where you are. Tell me where you're calling from.
I'm from India. Sorry. No.
No worries at all. Hi, Professor Holloway.
Hi.
My name is Edie Irele, and I'm calling in from Medellin, Colombia. I really appreciate your perspective on kind of social impact and kind of working ourselves out of business. I work at a social impact organization that works with participants throughout Latin America. And I guess the question that I have is, if you feel like perhaps design thinking has become such a buzzword that it's lost its true meaning. Because I have found that I'll go to design thinking workshops, for example, and I'll find that we go through all the steps, but I've actually never heard design thinking described in the way that you just described it now. And that description really speaks to me. But I wouldn't have come across, that description working in design thinking without having come to this webinar.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's why I think I cringed a little when I mentioned the term, because I don't like all these terms, right? Or like theory of change. It just means, what do you want to happen, right? So like we have, and social impact doesn't mean anything, right? Social enterprise doesn't mean anything. That's just a name, right? A social enterprise is not an actual real thing, right? Like it's not a legal structure. It's just a branding name for organization that might be a nonprofit or for-profit that has a social and sort of dual or triple mission around being financially sustainable and profitable and having an impact on people's lives and maybe having an environmental impact. But these are made up terms, so I agree. Yeah, and sometimes like if you read about design thinking, yeah, there's a lot of jargon in it. In reality, it's what like the business world has been doing forever, which is like customer discovery, right? Like don't build a toothpaste unless you have people try it out, but very few nonprofits have people try it out, right? They just show up. And so, yeah, I mean, the whole thing is backwards. And in the best possible scenario, if we think about the education context or like the K-12 education context, schools should be sitting around saying, what do we need? And then going out to the world and saying, start a company that does this because schools really need it, right? Or going to a funder and saying, funder, we need 4 different types of programs, find those people and bring them to us and please fund it. Instead, it's the nonprofit going to the funder saying, give me money because I know what schools need and then I'll deliver it. And then we don't have metrics, and that's a whole other discussion. But so I think partially out of like anger and frustration, I've started thinking about this stuff because I'm just watching so many resources get wasted. One thing I sort of learned along the way, and this may seem obvious, but like if you think about funding, right? So how many of you believe that, and Hudson, one second, how many of you believe that most nonprofits and most sort of social programming is funded by philanthropy, right? Like the Gates Foundations of the world. Anyone believe that? Anyone guess like what percent of nonprofits around the globe, and actually I think I only have US data, are funded by philanthropy? What percentage of those budgets? Anyone know? Maybe Hudson knows and that's why he's raising his hand. Just guess. Someone make up a number, percentage.
Maybe around 5%.
It's actually 15, but thank you, Melissa. But most people think like Gates is funding everything. right? Gates gives away a few $billions a year, which seems like a lot of money to us. But the New York City public school system, which I've spent a lot of time in, anyone know what that budget is? That annual operating budget of the New York City schools? It's about $30 billion. 30. So if Gates, that's trying to solve, and I'm not trashing Gates, but if Gates is, or other philanthropies are trying to solve global poverty, health, education, and they have $3 billion, and the New York City schools alone is a $30 billion budget, if they gave all their money to the New York City schools, it's still, that's the cost of food and school buses. Right? So for philanthropy to be funding operating budgets is a joke, right? Philanthropy needs to be about innovation and trying stuff out and failure and evaluating it, not funding operations, right? Government funds a lot of those operations. Government and actually fees. Most nonprofits are funded through fees, right? So Columbia is a nonprofit. Hospitals are nonprofits. People pay tuition. That's a fee. And then they subsidize it with philanthropy and, individual donations, et cetera. All right, Hudson, you're on. And tell us where you are in the world.
Yeah, good morning. I am dialed in from Houston, Texas. So it's a warm 75 degrees here right now.
Nice.
Thank you for joining us. I actually want to reorient my question to piggyback off of something you just said, which is that philanthropies should start to, kind of channel their funding towards more innovative problem solving. You mentioned earlier that scaling is a big problem for nonprofits. And I think one of the reasons for that is that donors want to see money go directly to impacts that they're investing in. And so how can you even go about creating a shift in thinking on the roles that nonprofits and philanthropy organizations play to maybe orient more towards what you're talking about with your course, which is identifying the needs and validating the solutions rather than trying to fund the solutions?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things in what you just said. So one thing is, and most people want to fund impact, as you said. They want to fund tangible programs, right? So if I said to you, hey, do you want to fund this organization it's doing, well, let's say if I ask you if you want to fund Columbia, do you want to fund Columbia? It's doing really great work. You might say yes, but if I said, and pretend you went to SEPA already, will you fund the books for the student who's from your hometown in Houston who can't afford to pay $37 for this textbook? You'd probably say yes, right? So most people give to something tangible. And in reality, you're donating to the organization and it may not actually go to fund those books. But people like to give to something they feel like they can see the impact. And so nonprofits are constantly struggling to raise what are called unrestricted dollars, right, or general operating support, which is how they build those reserve funds so they can grow, right? So nonprofits there's no working capital. So you can't actually innovate or try something out because you have no money to do it because all your money has to go towards your existing programs. It's really a struggle. But also my beef with that is, particularly with philanthropies, and they've changed during COVID. So the Ford Foundation says, here, we're giving you money for this program, and it must go to this program because we're restricting it. You're basically saying, we don't trust you, organization. We don't trust that what you're doing is impactful. Instead, the ideal is the foundation says, you've been doing amazing work for 25 years and we've supported you. We're just going to give you general operating support because we know you know what you're doing and we know the money's going to go well. But giving restricted donations, which is what almost everybody does, is saying, we don't trust you to manage this money properly, so we need to make sure it goes exactly here. And we don't want to pay for your executive director's salary, and we don't want to pay for your chief financial officer because that's overhead. We want to give you money directly. So it's really backwards. But to sort of answer the second part of your question around innovation, I mean, we have to demand that philanthropy looks different, right? So, and philanthropies have a lot of power. right? So any of you have worked in nonprofits and have raised money, donors are like the people you're scared of, right? Like you want to make them happy because you're dependent on them, right? So the relationship often is really crazy, right? If we could change that dynamic, nonprofits could go and say, we want to try out a bunch of new things and we might fail at 5 of them, but maybe the 6th will work. Give us some money to try that out. That doesn't happen. I wish it would. But also remember, a lot of these big philanthropies, I mean, and Gates, I think, does do some, they all do some innovative work, but I still think, for the most part, a lot of people at foundations are just complying with what the sort of structure at the foundation says they're giving money to, and so they have to stick within these guidelines. So it's pretty rigid. So I don't know how to solve that problem other than setting examples that do that, right? Sort of prizes that you know, I would love to see prizes that support failure, right? Trying stuff out. That doesn't really happen. I mean, there are certain prizes, but they're, you know, like the X Prize, or like they're these things that support innovation, but they're giving like 2 away, right? And it's very, not to depress you before you show up, but you know, SEPA students want to change the world, and they arrive, and to be able to become an entrepreneur at the end of that process is very privileged, right? Because most people have student loans and they have to go get a job. But that's why I think school is an opportunity to work on an idea. And if I could raise, and now you're inspiring me. I mean, you know, how can we raise a big pot of money so that we can fund people to try stuff out? That could be really amazing. All right, whoever comes, let's talk about building that. But we need to build stuff like that. So does anyone else have a question? Otherwise, I'm going to jump a little bit to, no? Okay. Oh, yes. Shalou. Shalou, where are you calling from? Or where are you Zooming from? Do we need to unmute someone so they can speak?
Shalou has the ability to speak. Shalou?
Okay.
Perhaps Shalou has some technical difficulties.
Okay. All right. Well, just chime in whenever you're ready. All right. So where should I go now? So, well, actually, I can talk a little bit about COVID and how that's changed some of how I'm thinking even about my teaching. And I feel like I learned so much from not only mistakes, but sort of being forced to try new things out. So COVID actually has, you know, obviously has changed a lot. So my social enterprise class this semester, which finished yesterday, instead of, normally students do need finding, as I mentioned. So we start the class and people basically come with a problem they've observed in the world, and then they form teams, and then they start working on defining that problem, because a lot of people come in and they want to boil the ocean, and I'm like, that's not happening. You need to zoom in. And so they spend a lot of time figuring out what is the actual problem we're trying to solve, whom are we solving it for, and they do this by talking to lots of people, which obviously was hard during COVID. So normally I'm like, you know, if they want to solve for something across the world, but they're in New York City, I'm like, just go talk to people on the quad of Columbia campus and see if anyone's been to that place, and then ask them questions. Like, there's no interview that doesn't give you some grain of information. So obviously that had to change during COVID, and luckily there's Zoom. But what I also realized during COVID is, normally, even though they do a lot of need finding, and then they come up with an idea, and then they iterate on that idea, and then they develop a prototype, and then they still work on a plan, like a multi-year plan for how to execute. And this term, I said, this is not reality. People write three-year business plans and 3-year budgets, and then they sit on a shelf, right? In reality, what happens when you finish a class and you finish graduate school and you have this idea, you have to go try it out, and you have to do a pilot. And so this sounds really simple, but this semester I said, I don't even want to see a plan. I just want to see a pilot idea and a pilot budget. Like, what do you need to get this idea off the ground and try it out, whether it's for a week or a month and so I sort of have shifted, and now instead of developing social enterprises, they're developing ideas for trying something out and seeing what happens next. So it sounds simple, but it's really just, I realized I was forcing them into sort of a structure that isn't really how the world actually works. Because I've had a lot of people who've taken my class start their ventures. Rarely are they what they thought they would be during class. Rarely have they ever looked at the business plan they wrote during class. Rarely has the budget been accurate in any way. Not because I don't know how to teach budgeting, but because budgets are made up. And so you really don't actually know till you get out there and do it. So, you know, pivoting to sort of creating a demonstration project. So now the class is going to be about need finding, really understanding the problem you're trying to solve, having deep empathy for the people who are feeling that problem, and then designing a demonstration project to see, is there a there, and then returning, and hopefully returning meaning return to the idea and then say, is it worth moving forward with this? And frankly, you can do that while you're in school. I feel like someone still has their hand raised. Shalou, do you now have a question? Oh, no, now they went away. Okay. So would really like to have a dialogue with you, so please ask me more questions. I'll tell you a little bit about sort of the other revelation I had. So I mentioned that at some point I realized that it was kind of elite to be thinking that all of my students could go out and start these ventures. But in reality, most of you, some of you may be entrepreneurs, but most of you will work for a company or government. And, you know, how could I teach you to be sort of more entrepreneurial in that context? So I decided to develop a course focused on people who want to be what I'll call intrapreneurs, like entrepreneurs within another structure. So I started a new class for people who don't want to start social enterprises, but might want to go work in one. So the course I'm teaching in the spring, it's called Design for Social Innovation. And it uses the same design thinking methodology, but on behalf of clients. So this course, this coming semester, we have 6 clients. And I can talk a little bit about who they are. And each of the clients came to me with a challenge, right? They didn't come to me and say, can you have your students build us this app? They came and said, we've been trying to figure out how to do this, and we can't figure it out. Could you and your students, who come from all over the world and all different backgrounds and are very interdisciplinary, whittle on this idea and come up with some ideas for how we might solve it? So basically, it's sort of a problem-solving class where clients come with a big idea that's not so well defined. Students then look into it, meaning they interview people, they talk to their client, they talk to their client's clients, they come up with ideas, they develop prototypes. And when I say prototype, a prototype might be an app, a prototype might be an experience, a prototype is a way to sort of demonstrate what you're doing, right? Because it's hard to respond. If I said, oh, I have this really great idea for this new program, but if I could prototype it and show you what it would be to experience the program, will be easier to respond to and get feedback. So they develop a prototype, and then they eventually either create the product or they develop a set of recommendations. So that is the structure of the course. We have 6 clients this coming term. We normally, and this is year 2. So last year I did the same thing and it was globally focused. This year we're more locally focused because people can't travel right now. So last year I had students go to Kyrgyzstan, Tunisia, Brazil, They spend a week with their client doing a deep dive, and then they spent the semester in the class working on the project for their client. Obviously, we can't do that right now, so we decided to focus on domestic. Well, we have one international project. And so one of our clients is the New York City Department of Education, the school system, that are looking to build the first virtual school. And they are trying to figure out who the school should be for, right? So they know how to design a school, and they can talk to technology people about what software to use, et cetera, but they're trying to figure out, who's this school for? Is this for kids who are chronically ill? Is this for kids whose parents move around a lot? Is this for any kid? And so our students are going to actually interview both experts, but also families, to try to understand who would benefit most from a virtual school. And then they're going to make recommendations for that school design. So that's one project. Another project is working with Sandy Hook Promise. So some of you may know Sandy Hook, which was a school, it's a school in Connecticut, where a mass shooter killed many, many students. And I don't remember the year. And so the families of the victims of these young children started this nonprofit, not to deal with gun violence, but to deal with sort of prevention, right? Like, why would somebody why would a young kid murder fellow students? It's obviously a mental health issue. So this organization works on young people mental health through the education system. And so our students are going to be working on a project for scaling some of their programming and figuring out how to best scale it by really understanding what schools need and talking to schools. And so that's another project. We have a third project is the High Line. So if any of you have been to New York City or live in New York City, there's something called the High Line, which is an old elevated railroad in Chelsea and the West Village of New York City that's turned into an incredible park. And so the High Line is struggling to figure out, because they realized during COVID, outdoor space, lots of New Yorkers are out utilizing space, but the people who mostly use the High Line are not locals. And so it's a lot of tourists. And so it's been empty, and they're trying to figure out, how do we bring New Yorkers to use this public park? And so really understanding why people don't use the High Line, right? If someone lives in the housing projects around the High Line, why aren't they there? Maybe they don't feel welcome, right? Maybe they don't feel like it's their park. So doing a lot of interview of New Yorkers to figure that out. So we have 6 clients. Students applied for the program. So this is a SEPA course, but it's open to the whole campus, which I really love, even though SEPA to me is the most interdisciplinary of schools, right? Like, SEPA to me represents every sector: public, private, agriculture, human rights. I mean, you're all aware of sort of the curriculum, but it's really true. I think SEPA is the most sort of global of schools. And so we already have interdisciplinary within SEPA, but I think it's really interesting for students to meet students from other schools. So this is open to other schools. We'll have 35 students in the class. Half will be SEPA, and then half will be from any other school. So we had 111 students apply from, I think, 12 schools. So public health, engineering, Columbia College and Barnard, social work, teachers college. We didn't have anyone from the medical school. Architecture, journalism. So it's awesome. And I've just spent 3 days interviewing people. And so we're putting together teams, but it's really, I think, what's so powerful about this class, and for the clients, and really my goal in the class is students have an amazing experience and build a portfolio of knowledge and tangible, like a report that they write, but also that the client has a good experience. Because often sort of student projects, sometimes they do for a client as a favor, and then it sits on a shelf. Like, we want to make sure they're implementing this. And so we're really strategic about how we pick. Like, clients have to come to us with an idea and really want to do it and really want to work with students, because there's a commitment there. And then we hope that we hope then it's actually implemented after the class. I can give a quick example, and then I'm really going to stop talking and you have to ask me questions, or we have a dialogue. So one example, so I taught the class for the first time this past spring. Obviously, COVID interrupted it. But what's amazing about, I think, the format we use, which is around this sort of design model and understanding your customer and the problem, is that it was very easy to pivot, right? Like the students weren't saying, we're developing this business and we're going to keep going. When COVID happened, they said, wait, how have the needs changed? Let's go talk to people more. And they pivoted. So one group of students were working with a local organization called Harlem Children's Zone. So Harlem Children's Zone is a pretty significant, like $100 million nonprofit that basically sectioned off like 40 square blocks of Harlem. And instead of doing what most nonprofits do, which is focus on one theme, like we're going to fix, you know, education, they basically said, if we want kids to be able to grow up in Harlem and get out, meaning get out of poverty and break the cycle of poverty, we need to surround them with services, not just develop an after-school program or a college-bound program. We need to work with their parents. We need like pre-K programs. We need baby programs. We need to work with mothers while they're pregnant. And so they basically created this holistic model of programming in the Bronx, in Harlem. And so our students project initially had been focused on the fact that they have all these services for the community, not just education. Like they have a charter school, they have hundreds of programs that are all education related and parenting related, but they also provide services like tax help or feeding programs. And no one was coming to those programs and they didn't understand why. And so our students basically went out to the community and talked to everybody to really understand. And what they realized was that most people thought Harlem Children's Zone only served children. And so they didn't even know about the programs. They also realized that their only distribution to reach people in the community was through their own programming. And if you came into one of their buildings, but no one's going to come into their building if they're not, attending one of their programs. So the students realized there are all these other community resources as a distribution model to reach these New Yorkers. One of them are like bodegas, right? Little grocery stores in the community, or churches, or they sort of figured out, where does everyone go? How do we reach people? Where do they show up? And so they designed a program they basically mapped the entire community, which this organization had never done, to understand what are all the community touch points and resources where they could be advertising their program. So then in the middle of this, COVID happened, and they basically quickly used what they were working on, this map, to help distribute resources, including masks at the beginning when it was hard to get masks, to the community. So, and then the students ended up actually working over the summer with the organization, and 2 of them are actually still working there, and 1 of them was offered a job. So the program continues. But I think what they found really powerful, the organization found really powerful, is that external people like students who are non-threatening, and I tell students when they go out into the community, like, wear a Columbia sweatshirt or a hat, so people think like somehow a brand like that seems safe, right? Students had the ability to talk to people and get honest feedback, whereas the organization, 1, didn't have the resources to do that, right? That's nobody's job. And 2, don't always get an honest answer, because they're going to probably filter their answer if they think, someone represents the organization instead of students getting real feedback. So I'm going to pause because we only have 8 minutes and I've done way more talking than I wanted to.
Professor Holloway, I feel like there are so many questions that came in the chat early on.
Oh, good, fun. Let me look.
The session when you were.
But I didn't see that because I get really distracted by the chat, and then my mom. Ooh, that's awesome. Maybe you shouldn't tell your mom that, because maybe it's private information. Oops. I think it's okay. They should. Do you file implementation? Yes, we always follow up with a client. Again, this is only the 2nd year I'm doing this. We are, I mean, the clients from the spring, we are still in touch with, and we hope to stay in touch. We also hope clients repeat, right? Meaning they come back and, my students are working on with a client outside of class right now, which is Sesame Workshop. You probably all know Sesame Street. And so they were a fall project that's now turned into a client, and they have like a million other things they want to do. So we're assuming we sort of have some continuity, but yeah, it's be great to figure out too. And maybe some of you can help me with this. How do we keep the project? I'm really bad at using media or like social media or building communities. I'd really love to figure out how to use technology to sort of build content around some of these projects so we can see how they evolve and also have the clients give feedback. So maybe it's like a Google group or a blog or something, but, and I can't tell where the other questions are. I'm just going to call on people. So,
Oh, there was a good question in the chat. Do you have examples of nonprofits that are doing social impact measurement well?
not really. Well, I'll answer that generally. I think it depends what they're doing. There's some things that are a lot easier to measure, like a job training program, right? So you train 50 people, those are your outputs. They got jobs, and they kept the job, and their salary went up by 30%. Like those are the outcomes. Those are a little more tangible. And then the impacts is like, how did their life change and their family change? And did their kids get to go to college because they kept the job? And sort of what are the long-term? People don't really have that long-term data, but some of them have this sort of outcome data. So I think that's much more tangible than, for example, like a feeding program, right? The fact that someone's no longer hungry, like that's harder to measure. You can borrow other people's data. I would look at the Robin Hood Foundation. I think they do a really good job with their grantees and metrics. And so a lot of their grantees have really good data. But I think it's messy. I mean, even I'm on 4 boards right now. I'm not sure I think any of them are doing a really good job. They're really still in the like output counting heads land there, and a lot of them are trying to have systemic change. That's even harder. And you know, but sometimes, so to reverse what I've said all along, sometimes sort of qualitative and those stories are impactful enough, right? Like, but it's, again, that's sort of hard to report in on. I'm going to pause because I have other questions. Pranati, did I pronounce your name right?
Yeah, hi, I'm Pranati from New Delhi, India. Thank you so much for your insights. It's been a really interesting session for me, especially because I kind of work with the public sector, not so much with social enterprises. So it's very, very informative for me. I think my question comes from the perspective I've had so far, which is, you know, a lot of the work that we do with CSR also comes from corporate CSR. So in India, it's kind of mandated that 2% from every corporate needs to go to a social responsibility. So I'm just wondering, in terms of funding for, you know, profits for social enterprises, how effective do you think CSR contributions are? Do you think they promote greater collaboration between profit-driven enterprises and non-profit enterprises, or do you think it's not as effective?
That's a great question. I think, I mean, am I allowed to say something negative? No, I mean, I think CSR is well-meaning, but a lot of it's to benefit the business, right? To look like a good corporate citizen. You know, a lot of CSR relates to the business's theme. So like a lot of banks, CSR is around financial literacy because they want future clients. I'm not saying that's bad. They're still giving money, right? And there's often, I had a debate in my class around philanthropy and should we take it? Like, should we take money from a tobacco company, right? And you should have filters, but frankly, if it's getting resources, great. So I think some CSR can be really effective, meaning you're getting dollars and you're often getting volunteers, right? So to me, a lot of the benefit too is that you're getting people to connect with these communities, which makes them more aware, and then hopefully individually they're giving. So I think that can be a positive. To my earlier point around philanthropy and its impact in terms of dollars, CSR is teeny. I mean, it's like 1%, right? So it needs to be in a way more strategic. Again, I have a complaint. If things are funding operating budgets, they're not helping, right? It should be a lever. It should be about sort of innovation or funding something that normally wouldn't be funded. But I have seen effective CSR, and a lot of companies now are trying to be more innovative in that. Like MasterCard is doing a lot of interesting work in sort of innovation. A lot of companies are now looking at like starting impact funds and investing in ventures and growth instead of just funding a program or a campaign. So I think they're all everyone's trying to be more strategic. This is before COVID, but I think, again, at some point everyone said, okay, we're funding this stuff. Is it helping? And so people are trying to either, one, fund more innovation. And I think a lot of CSR is looking at that innovation. Like Citibank, for example, a lot of what they're doing now in community is around like impact funding and investing in young companies that they think really can have some leverage. So I think people are rethinking it, and people, again, are thinking about these outcomes and like, how do we get better outcomes? And so I think I think it's open, like the whole thing's starting to evolve. A lot of young people are interested in philanthropy. I mean, I don't have this data point, but like the trillions of dollars that are going to be inherited by a lot of young, wealthy people, these people don't want to just fund the same stuff their parents did. So I think there's going to be some innovation there.
Yeah.
I wish they would all come to SEPA and be students so we could help them direct that, because I think a lot of them do what's sexy. That's my other beef in the sector, is like the people who get a lot of funding are really good at marketing, not necessarily really good at delivering. So anyway, I think we have to wrap, but Hudson had another question. But thank you for your question. And I know I didn't fully answer it, but.
No, that was great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
It depends. Some are great, some aren't. Right? And often people working in CSR didn't come from the program world, right? They haven't done that work to understand the need. They come from like the marketing department, right? Please don't record this and blast it on the internet, because I'll get yelled at.
No, not at all.
But then close this out.
Yeah, so kind of piggybacking off of your point that you said that soon a generation will inherit a lot of wealth, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on if the types of projects and programming that's funded is affected by the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and if that's going to have kind of a trickle-down effect into philanthropic giving.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think these philanthropists have a lot of power, right? I mean, like Chan Zuckerberg Foundation has decided they're doing they're controlling a lot of what happens, for sure. But government has more power always, because government is funding most of it. So we've sort of given we're giving a lot of credit to the philanthropists, but they're really not the ones having the biggest impact. I do think they can direct dollars places that they're making decisions about where dollars are going, because then people follow them. Right. So there's a lot of, people often look to certain philanthropists to know what they're doing, right? Like a Gates or a Buffett. And then people sort of follow, as opposed to forging their own path. I hope they sort of forge their own path. But I also really think we need the people on the ground who are not only experiencing the problem, but actually understand it. Right. So like, to me, like a scrappy little nonprofit in the Bronx that's working with kids knows a lot more about kids than anyone at a foundation. And like, how do we get people to talk to them more? How are they more of the decision makers? Right. And that shift hasn't happened. And I think that's really, really important. So I don't I'm not sure I can answer your question completely.
No, that's okay, but thank
Looking
you.
at ethics, profits, struggling.
Professor Holloway, we have one more question, and I think this can be kind of concluded in closing remarks for anyone who's interested in your courses and the management specialization. But I've been seeing a lot of messages regarding the difference between looking at social entrepreneurship from the public policy perspective versus perhaps the MBA program or the program at SPS, the nonprofit management.
Meaning trying to understand how they're the different approaches of the different schools?
Correct.
Yeah, and to be honest, I'm not an expert on all the classes. I think, you know, the business school has a ton of entrepreneurship classes, and if you come to SEPA, take advantage of, you know, we have 20 schools at Columbia. That's, to me, the benefit of being at a university. Like, there's students who take classes at Public Health and Teachers College. Like, if you want an evaluation course, Teachers College has amazing classes. So really, that's a great advantage. So, and the business school has a lot of classes. I think the approach is just somewhat different. So, like, the business school's looking more at business models and financial sustainability. And again, my class is looking more at like figuring out what the actual problem is you're trying to solve and for whom, and really sort of developing the best intervention and figuring out those metrics around impact, et cetera. And then the business model you can either sort of figure out or buy. So I think it's just different approaches. But again, and frankly, to me, the best case scenario is you take a class in social entrepreneurship at any school, right? And let's say you start with SEPA, you work on it in my class, then you figure out a way to use that same idea and work on a research project or work on it in another class, right? You're going to see that there are ways to, like, a lot of students who've ended up starting social ventures, and I didn't even get to talk about them, but if you Google SEPA Global Entrepreneurs, you will get to a website that I created that highlights 25 social entrepreneurs that came out of SEPA. So I'd take a look at sort of that, but I think use your time in school to work on this idea, because you don't take one class and start a venture, right? In reality, it's like you need to be working on it, and then you need to pilot it, and you're going to be a startup for years, right? So assume that you need to take multiple classes to continue working on it. So there are lots of opportunities to do that. So I think you can combine, you could take a business school class on entrepreneurship in Africa, and then you can take my class, and then you can take another class. And so, and then you can, you know, in one of your policy classes, work on a research project around it. So I think just sort of leverage the fact that you're in school and you can get support from multiple professors. And anyway, I know I didn't fully answer the question, but I'd say you want a little of everything.
Awesome. Well, on behalf of admissions, thank you so much, Professor Holloway, for joining us today. I can tell,
I
like,
hope to see some of you are coming in January, yes? No, maybe?
Yes, Professor.
Okay.
Some of us are, yeah.
Awesome. Well, find me. Email me. I'm smh124@columbia.edu.
I dropped a link to the management website for anyone who's interested in that, and you can find Professor Holloway's contact information. I believe she's also typing that in the chat.
I'm typing it.
We had so many great questions. If you want to follow up, please feel free to email her, email us, the admissions team. You have our email in your confirmation email. All right. Again, thank you. And enjoy the rest of your Friday. Bye.
Thank you.